They say fire is a purifier. They're wrong. Fire doesn't clean anything. It just decides what gets to survive. Rebecca Monroe thought she was just doing her job, keeping a little boy safe while his father ran the world from behind a glass desk on the 42nd floor. She didn't know the boy she was protecting was the heir to one of the most feared criminal empires east of the Mississippi. She didn't know that the fire consuming the townhouse around her was no accident. And she had no idea that the moment she dove back into those flames to pull him out, she had just made herself the most important woman alive. She saved the boy's life. But she was about to discover that saving him came with a price tag nobody warned her about. This is the soot-stained shield. The hourly rate was $22.50. That was what the Nanny Now agency had listed in the contract Rebecca Monroe signed 8 months ago. $22.50, plus transportation reimbursement and a quarterly performance bonus that Mr. Ji-hoon Park had never once failed to include, always in a crisp cream envelope, always with a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you. Min-jun trusts you." Rebecca had tucked the notes into a shoebox under her bed. She didn't know why. Maybe because nobody had thanked her for anything in a long time. It was a Tuesday in late October, and Chicago had decided to skip autumn entirely and go straight to punishment. The wind off Lake Michigan hit like something personal. Rebecca pulled the collar of her white button-up blouse tighter as she walked the 3 blocks from the bus stop to the Park townhouse on East Erie Street. She was always put together for the job, neat black slacks, hair pressed straight against her shoulders, the professional armor of someone who understood that a black woman in a wealthy neighborhood had to look twice as intentional just to be seen as competent. She rang the buzzer at 7:02 a.m. The housekeeper, Mrs. Yoon, didn't answer. That was the first wrong thing. Rebecca frowned at the door. Mrs. Yoon was always at the buzzer by 6:55. The woman treated punctuality like a religion. Rebecca pressed the buzzer again. Held it. Nothing. She checked her phone. No messages from Mr. Park. No calendar changes. No alerts from the agency. She was lifting her hand to knock when she smelled it. Not smoke. Not exactly. Something sharper. Chemical. The kind of smell that prickled at the back of your throat and whispered, "Run." She didn't run. She tried the handle. The door swung inward. The hallway beyond was thick with gray haze, and somewhere deep in the house, somewhere upstairs, where the bedrooms were, where Min-jun's room was, she heard it. Not a scream. A cough. Small and wet and terrified. Rebecca didn't think. If she had thought, she would have remembered she was 31 years old with a mother in dialysis and a lease she could barely afford. She would have remembered that she was a nanny, not a firefighter, not a soldier, not a woman built for burning buildings. But the cough came again. She went in. The staircase was already glowing orange at the top. The banister was hot beneath her palm. She could hear the fire now, not crackling the way it did in movies, but roaring, hungry, consuming the air itself. Smoke stung her eyes and her lungs clenched like fists. Min-jun. Her voice tore out of her. Min-jun, answer me. A sound. Room 3. The door at the end of the hall. Flames had eaten through the ceiling directly above the hallway. A beam groaned. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall and moved fast, faster than she knew she could move, heat blasting against the side of her face, singeing her hairline, blistering the skin of her forearm as she shielded her face. She hit the door with her shoulder. It gave. Min-jun was on the floor beside his bed, knees pulled to his chest, his small blue sweater streaked with soot. He had tucked himself into the corner the way she'd taught him during thunderstorms, small and still and waiting for someone safe. I've got you. She crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered him up. He wrapped his arms around her neck with the absolute trust of a child who had never had reason to doubt her. She turned back toward the door. The hallway ceiling had collapsed. The only way out was through the window. She went through the glass shoulder first, shielding Min Jun's head with her body, and they dropped 8 feet onto the fire escape landing, her knees cracking against the metal grating, her blouse shredding at the shoulder, her palms bleeding where she caught the railing. By the time they hit the rain-slicked street below, the fire department's hoses were already arcing orange water at the roofline. Red and white lights strobed across the wet asphalt. Neighbors stood behind police tape with their phones raised, witnesses to a story they didn't yet understand. Rebecca sat on the curb with Min Jun in her lap, her arms locked around him, her face streaked with soot and tears and something she couldn't name. Her blouse was ruined, her hair undone, every polished edge of her professional armor stripped away. She was shaking. He was shaking. "You came back," he whispered against her neck. "I always come back," she told him. "That's my job." For black SUVs. No plates. They moved like a cortege, slowly, deliberately, parting the crowd without a word or a horn. The vehicles stopped in a precise formation around the burning building, and the doors opened, and the men who stepped out were not police. They wore suits, not uniforms, and their eyes moved the way the eyes of dangerous men always move, cataloging threats, calculating exits. Ji-hoon Park stepped out. He was dressed the way he always was, a perfectly cut charcoal suit, a silk tie, the quiet armor of empire, but his collar was open for the first time Rebecca had ever seen, and his face. He was scanning the crowd with the focused panic of a man who controlled everything and had just lost the only thing that mattered. Then his eyes found Rebecca on the curb. Found the boy in her arms. She had worked for Ji-hoon Park for 8 months. She had never seen him run. She had barely seen him walk fast. He was a man who moved through the world as if the world adjusted itself to match his pace. He dropped to his knees on the wet asphalt in front of her, his $4,000 trousers hitting the ground without hesitation, and gathered Min Jun out of her arms. He held his son against his chest and pressed his face into the boy's hair and said nothing for a long time. When he looked up at Rebecca, she expected relief. What she saw instead was something cold. Something careful. Something that settled behind his eyes like a door closing. "The fire didn't start itself," he said quietly. His voice was barely above a murmur. Around them, his men had formed a perimeter. Even the firefighters had stopped moving. "Someone sent a message tonight. And you?" His eyes moved over her torn blouse, her bleeding palms, the soot-covered face of a woman who had just walked through fire for his child. "You wrote the reply." Rebecca opened her mouth. Closed it. "Mr. Park." He was already standing, already pulling out a phone that had more screens than any phone she'd ever seen. He said 2 words to the man nearest him. Just 2. Within 60 seconds, every traffic light on the block went dark. Within 2 minutes, she heard distant sirens stop, not fade, stop, as if the city had taken a single breath and held it. People around her raised their phones and stared at dead screens with confused, frightened faces. Ji-hoon Park had not called the police. He had called something older, and quieter, and far more absolute. He turned back to Rebecca one last time. Min Jun still clung to him, one small hand fisted in his father's open collar. "You didn't leave him," Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a question. No. Something shifted in his expression, just a millimeter, just a fraction of something she didn't have a name for yet. "Then you're coming with us." It was not an invitation. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The fire had a sound. That was the thing nobody warned you about. Not a crackle, not a roar, a consumption. A steady, pressurized eating of everything the house had ever been. Rebecca hit the top of the staircase and the heat slammed into her like a wall of solid air, forcing her back a half step before her feet caught. The hallway ahead was unrecognizable. The wallpaper, pale cream with small silver birds, she had walked past it 100 times, had curled black and fallen away in sheets. The overhead light fixture was gone, replaced by an orange glow that pulsed like something alive. 2 of the bedroom doors were sealed behind walls of flame. The third, at the end of the hall, was still closed. Rebecca pulled her blouse up over her nose and mouth and moved. The carpet was hot through the soles of her shoes. Above her, the ceiling made a sound like a slow exhalation, the breath of a structure deciding whether to hold or let go. She didn't look up. Looking up was for people who had the luxury of hesitation. A section gave way with a crack that she felt in her back teeth, and burning debris cascaded down 6 feet to her right, close enough that she felt the displacement of air, close enough that a burning fragment caught the back of her hand and she sucked in a breath of smoke and immediately regretted it. Her lungs rejected it all at once. She coughed so hard her vision went gray at the edges. Move. She pushed through it. Move or he burns. She hit Minjun's door and tried the handle, hot, but not scalding, and shoved it open. The room beyond was hazy but breathable. He had done exactly what she drilled into him during the thunderstorm games, during the what do we do if games she'd invented when Mr. Park was traveling and the nights felt long. He was on the floor beside the bed, below the smoke line, knees to his chest, his blue sweater streaked gray. His eyes found her the moment she crossed the threshold. There was a particular kind of trust in a child's face when someone they love walks into the worst moment. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. Something that said, I knew you would come. Rebecca felt it land in the center of her chest and did not have time to fall apart over it. Arms up. She gathered him in one motion, the way she had 1,000 times, bath time, bedtime, the night he had a fever of 103 and she'd sat with him until 4 in the morning because Mr. Park was in Seoul and Mrs. Yoon had gone home sick. He locked his arms around her neck without a word. She turned back toward the door and the hallway had changed again. The ceiling beam she had passed under 20 seconds ago was now on the floor, a burning diagonal bar blocking the path back to the stairs. She did not waste time grieving the staircase. She crossed to the window. The latch was painted shut, of course it was. She hit it with her elbow. Once, twice, and on the third strike the frame splintered and the window swung out and the night air hit her face like cold water. 8 feet below was the iron landing of the fire escape. Behind her, she heard the structural groan of something that was about to stop being a floor. Hold on tight, she told him. Don't let go no matter what. She went through shoulder first, shielding his head with her body, and the night swallowed them whole. She caught the railing with one hand on the way down. It tore the skin clean off her palm. She barely registered it. Her knees hit the grating and buckled and she went down hard, one hand still braced between Minjun and the iron, and she crouched there on the fire escape with the building roaring above her and the city spreading cold and rain-soaked below. By the time she carried him down the remaining flights and stepped onto the wet asphalt, the block had filled with the particular chaos of a city emergency, sirens overlapping, neighbors in coats they'd thrown on over pajamas, a paramedic unit trying to move through a crowd that didn't know which way to part. Someone put a silver thermal blanket around her shoulders. Someone else tried to take Minjun and she tightened her arms instinctively before she could stop herself. Ma'am, let us assess him. He's breathing. No burns. I'll hold him until his father gets here. Her voice came out flat and certain, the voice of a woman who had made a decision and wasn't reopening it. She sat on the curb. Minjun sat in her lap. Neither of them spoke. She smelled them before she heard them. An exhaust note that was too smooth, too controlled, engines that had been built for discretion. Then the motorcade turned onto East Erie Street and the noise of the crowd shifted, changed register, became something quieter and more uneasy. 4 black SUVs in tight formation, moving like a single organism. No plates. No emergency lights. The vehicles stopped in a configuration that managed, without any obvious aggression, to seal the block at both ends. The doors opened and the men who stepped out wore suits, not badges, and their eyes moved across the scene with the precise efficiency of people conducting a threat assessment rather than a rescue. Ji-hoon Park was not a tall man, but he occupied space in a way that taller men never managed. The suit was charcoal, the tie silk and dark, the shoes almost certainly worth more than Rebecca's monthly rent, and his collar was open, the tie loosened 3 inches, which on any other day would have been unthinkable. She had worked for him for 8 months and she had never seen a single hair out of place. Now his hair was disheveled, his jaw tight, and his eyes, dark and composed under every other circumstance she had observed, were moving across the scene with something raw and barely controlled underneath the surface. He was scanning. Searching. And then he found them on the curb. He crossed the street at a run. A full, unself-conscious run, his dress shoes slapping the wet asphalt, his security detail falling into step around him and then dropping back when he outpaced them. He dropped to his knees in front of her, both knees, no hesitation, $4,000 trousers against the rain-soaked street, and reached for his son. Min-jun went to him. He wrapped both arms around his father's neck and pressed his face into the hollow of Ji-hoon's shoulder and made a sound that Rebecca had never heard from him before, not quite a sob, not quite a sigh, something in between, something that belonged only to the space between a child and the person they are most certain of in the world. Ji-hoon closed his eyes. Just for 3 seconds. His arms tightened around the boy and his face, that composed, expensive, impenetrable face, cracked open along a line that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with terror that had arrived too late to act on. He looked at Rebecca over his son's shoulder. His eyes moved over her with methodical precision, the torn blouse, the bleeding palm wrapped in a thermal blanket, the soot that had settled into the fine lines around her eyes, the hair that had come loose and hung in dark waves against her face. "The fire didn't start itself," he said. Very quiet. The voice of a man who didn't need volume. "No," she agreed. "It didn't smell right from the street. Chemical accelerant. The kind that moves fast and burns hot and makes sure nobody gets out." Something passed through his expression, brief and unreadable, like a word in a language she didn't yet speak. "You have a good nose, Ms. Monroe. I grew up in Englewood. You learned to read smoke early." He stood, Min-jun still folded against his chest, and turned to the man who had materialized at his left shoulder, mid-40s, crew cut, the stillness of someone trained to be invisible. Ji-hoon said 2 words. The traffic lights died first. All 4 at the intersection of Erie and Michigan went dark simultaneously, as though a switch had been thrown somewhere deep beneath the city. The crosswalk signals followed. Then the street lamps along the block dimmed to half power and held there, bathing everything in a flat amber dusk. Rebecca watched people around her raise their phones. Stare at them. Lower them with expressions that moved from confusion to something quieter, something closer to unease. The sirens, the ones that had been converging from the north, stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As though someone had called ahead and explained, with complete authority, that their services would not be necessary. In the sudden partial quiet, she could hear Ji-hoon on the phone. He wasn't shouting. He never shouted. He was giving instructions in a low, even tone, switching between English and Korean without pausing, and the man with the crew cut was relaying them outward through an earpiece to people Rebecca couldn't see. She had heard the name before. Never from Ji-hoon, from a conversation between 2 of his associates she wasn't supposed to overhear 6 months ago, when she'd come back early from Min-jun's pediatric appointment and the office door had been slightly open. "The ghost of Chicago," one of them had said, and the other had laughed, a short and humorless sound. "The city breathes when he says breathe and holds it when he says hold." She had filed it away the way she filed away many things about her employer, carefully, without conclusion, behind a door she kept closed. Ji-hoon returned to where she stood and looked at her with that same precise, calculating calm. "The police have been redirected. The press will be managed. There will be no incident report from tonight." "That's not legal." "No," he agreed, without any apparent concern. "It is not." He paused. Someone tried to kill my son tonight, Ms. Monroe. I am not particularly interested in legality at this moment. She looked at Min Jun, still pressed against his father's shoulder, watching her with those dark, careful eyes. He raised one hand and extended his pinky finger toward her, their signal, the one she'd invented for I'm okay, you okay? She extended hers back. Ji-hoon caught the exchange. Said nothing about it. You'll come with us. Again, not an invitation. Not quite an order either, something in the middle, the cadence of a man who had not had to ask for things in a very long time. My apartment is no longer safe. Whoever did this knows your face now. You carried him out of that building in front of 40 witnesses and 3 news vans. He held her gaze. You are a variable they will want to eliminate. She stood there on the wet, amberlit street with a thermal blanket over her ruined blouse and smoke still sitting in the back of her lungs, and she thought about her mother's dialysis schedule, her lease, her shoebox of thank you notes, every small ordinary anchor of the life she'd had 6 hours ago. Then she looked at Min Jun. He was watching her the way he always watched her when something was uncertain. Not frightened. Waiting. With a patience that no 4-year-old should possess, the patience of a child who had learned early that the adults around him moved in ways he couldn't always follow, and had decided that Rebecca was the one worth keeping his eyes on. The building had no name on the exterior. It stood 42 stories on the near north side, a glass and steel tower that had the quiet arrogance of serious money, not the flashy kind, not the kind that needed to announce itself, but the kind that had been accumulating long enough that it simply assumed the world would make room. They entered through an underground parking level with a guard post that had more technology than a TSA checkpoint and significantly less patience. The elevator required a palm scan and a 6-digit code and the presence of a specific man in a gray suit who said nothing to Rebecca the entire ride up and stared at the middle distance with professional blankness. The penthouse floor had no visible seams. The floors were pale stone, the walls glass on 3 sides, the city spread below in a grid of lights that made Rebecca feel briefly as though she had been lifted out of the world entirely and was observing it from somewhere uninvolved. It was beautiful the way a weapon could be beautiful, technically perfect and fundamentally cold. Ji-hoon moved through the space with the ease of someone who had designed it. He handed Min Jun to a woman Rebecca hadn't seen before, Korean, 50s, silver-haired, with the expression of someone who had navigated high-stakes environments her entire life and had long since stopped being impressed by them. She took the boy with a tenderness that was the first warm thing Rebecca had seen in an hour. Mrs. Seo will settle him, Ji-hoon said. She's been with our family since before Min Jun was born. She is the only person in this building, besides myself, whose presence is uncontested. Rebecca noted the phrasing. Uncontested. Not trusted. Uncontested. The difference was the kind that mattered. She was shown to a room that was larger than her apartment and stocked with clothing in her size that she was certain had not been purchased in the last 90 minutes. The bathroom had a first aid kit that was more comprehensive than any she'd seen outside a hospital. She cleaned her palm, wrapped it, stood in the steam of a shower that she was too wired to fully feel, and dressed in clothes that fit precisely and had no labels. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The view was extraordinary. You could see everything from up here, the grid of streets, the lake stretching black at the eastern edge, the amber threads of traffic moving through the dark. You could see who was coming from every direction. She thought about what Ji-hoon had said. A potential trap. The phrase had occurred to her without a prompt, without context, and it sat at the base of her skull and declined to leave. A building this visible, this centralized, this high, it was a fortress, yes. But a fortress was only as good as the integrity of the people inside it. There was a knock at her door. Quiet, precise, 2 knuckles. Min Jun stood in the hallway in clean pajamas, holding a stuffed rabbit missing one ear that he had owned since before Rebecca started working for the family. He was alone. Which meant he had come on his own, which meant he had navigated whatever security was between his room and hers on 4-year-old determination alone. She crouched down to his level. How did you get here? He didn't answer. He lifted the rabbit slightly, an offering, and looked at her with those enormous dark eyes, and took 2 steps forward and leaned his forehead against her shoulder. She let him in. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed and he climbed into her lap with the rabbit and they sat like that, in the vast glass room with the city below them, until his breathing slowed and evened and he slipped into the deep, boneless sleep of the very young. The building staff noticed it first, the complete, deliberate silence. Mrs. Seo reported it to Ji-hoon with visible worry. Ji-hoon relayed it to a child psychologist who arrived by private car and spent 45 minutes with Min-jun and left looking thoughtful. The psychologist told Ji-hoon it was a trauma response, selective mutism, not uncommon, nothing to force, time and safety would restore it. Min-jun was talking. Just not with words. They had built the language slowly over 8 months, not intentionally at first, just organically, the way communication developed between 2 people who spent enough hours together that words became redundant for small things. A tap on the knee meant I'm hungry. 3 slow blinks meant I'm tired but I don't want to admit it. A pinky finger extended meant I'm okay, you okay? An open hand, palm up, meant I don't understand what's happening but I trust you to explain it. He used the open hand a lot in those 4 days. Rebecca explained what she could, simply, honestly, in the flat reassuring tone she'd learned worked better with him than any softened version of the truth. They were staying somewhere safe. His father was working to fix what had happened. Nobody was going to hurt him. Each time she said it, he watched her face the way children watched faces when they were deciding whether to believe you, not listening to the words, exactly, but reading the thing behind the words. He always extended his pinky after. Always. Ji-hoon observed this from doorways, from across rooms, with an expression Rebecca could not decode. He had not spoken to her much since the night they arrived, brief functional exchanges, logistics, security briefings delivered by the crew-cut man whose name she'd learned was Kong. Ji-hoon himself was elsewhere most of each day, behind closed doors, on calls she could not hear, receiving people who arrived and departed with the purposeful quiet of men managing a crisis that had no official name. On the 4th evening she found him in the kitchen, an unusual enough occurrence that she stopped in the doorway. He was standing at the counter with 2 cups of tea that had gone cold, staring at the city through the glass, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He used your hand signal today, Ji-hoon said, without turning around. The open hand. He used it with me. She came in slowly and picked up one of the cold cups and said nothing. I didn't know what it meant. I had to ask Mrs. Seo, who didn't know either. He paused. I had to ask my 4-year-old son's nanny what my son was trying to tell me, because she is the only person who speaks his language. He said it without accusation. But there was something in the flatness of his voice that suggested he was sitting with a truth he hadn't expected to be confronted with on top of everything else. He made it up himself, Rebecca said. The open hand. He was about 2.5 and he wanted to ask me something but didn't have the word, and he just held out his hand. So that's what it became. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved on below them, indifferent and lit. What did he want to know? He asked. When he used it with me. She looked at him carefully. It means, I don't understand what's happening, but I trust you to explain it. Ji-hoon set down his cup. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and stood there for a moment that felt private enough that she considered leaving. Then I owe him an explanation, he said finally. Yes, she agreed. You do. He looked at her then, not the assessment of the street, not the calculation of the first night, but something more direct, something that acknowledged she was not just a variable in the architecture of his crisis but a person who had walked through fire and come out the other side still holding his son. I should have thanked you properly. Yes, she said again. You should have. A beat. And then, small, careful, human, the corner of his mouth moved. The first thing close to warmth she had seen from him since the night on the street when his face had broken open for 3 seconds. In the room down the hall, Minjun slept with his one-eared rabbit and the city blazed quietly below, sealed and silent under whatever Ji-hoon Park had done to it. Rebecca stood in the kitchen of the golden bunker and felt, for the first time, that she was not simply inside someone else's world. She found it on the 5th day, and only because of the rabbit. Minjun had developed a habit of carrying the one-eared rabbit everywhere, tucking it under his arm with the specific possessiveness of a child who had lost most of his belongings in a single night and was not prepared to lose anything else. Rebecca had been rotating his medical kit, the small nylon case Mrs. Seo had brought from a storage unit Ji-hoon kept on the north side, stocked with Minjun's nebulizer, his allergy medications, his emergency epinephrine, and when she unzipped the inner pocket to check the expiration on his antihistamines, she found something that had no reason to be there. It was smaller than a thumbnail. Matte black, slightly warm to the touch, with a texture that felt like brushed carbon fiber. She almost set it aside thinking it was a button that had come loose from something. Then she held it up to the light. It had no seam. No thread hole. No imperfection at all. She set it on the bathroom counter and looked at it for a long time without touching it again. Her mind moved methodically through the chain of custody on the medical kit, who had packed it, who had transported it, who had had access to it in the 5 days since they'd arrived in the building. The list was not long. It was also not as short as it should have been. She didn't go to Ji-hoon. Not yet. She went to Minjun instead, who was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with his rabbit, arranging and rearranging a set of wooden blocks that Mrs. Seo had produced from somewhere. She sat beside him and took one of the blocks and placed it carefully in his formation, and he gave her a sideways look that meant he knew she hadn't come to play blocks. She held out her open palm. "I don't understand what's happening, but I trust you to explain it." He blinked at her. Then he reached into the front pocket of his small canvas jacket, the one Mrs. Seo had dressed him in that morning, and he produced a second device. Identical. Matte black, thumbnail-sized, no seam. He had found it in the rabbit's remaining ear. He had not told anyone. He had simply been carrying it, waiting. Rebecca looked at this 4-year-old boy who had decided to hold his evidence quietly rather than cause panic, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have immediate language for. "You are," she told him quietly, "the smartest person in this building." He extended his pinky. She touched hers to it. She wrapped both devices in a cloth and put them in her pocket and went to find Ji-hoon. She passed Kong in the hallway, crew cut, earpiece, the measured stillness of a man trained to read threats. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She did not stop. She did not tell him what was in her pocket, because the medical kit had come through Kang's team, and the list of people with access was not as short as it should have been, and she was not yet prepared to narrow that list by trusting the wrong person. She found Ji-hoon in the war room, what she privately called the glass-walled office at the north end of the floor where he spent most of his hours, surrounded by screens that showed feed from cameras she couldn't identify and locations she didn't recognize. He looked up when she entered without knocking. She set both devices on the desk between them without a word. He looked at them. The room went very still. "Where?" he said. "His medical kit and the rabbit. One in each." She paused. Minjun found the second one himself. "He's been sitting on it for at least 2 days." Something moved across Ji-hoon's face, not anger, not yet. Something colder and more deliberate. The expression of a man recalibrating. "They know exactly where we are," he said. "Yes. Then we're already out of time." Ji-hoon spent 4 minutes on the phone and said nothing to her during those 4 minutes. When he hung up, he told her 3 things. The building's east stairwell camera had been looped for the past 6 hours, 2 of Kang's men had not checked in for their last rotation, and there was a private car waiting in the service tunnel beneath the building, put there 40 minutes ago by someone who was not on his payroll. He told her to get Minjun. He told her to take the service elevator, not the main one. He told her the code for the tunnel access panel, 4 digits, change after use, and he told her that there was a gray car in sublevel 3, a specific bay, and that the keys were above the visor. "And you?" she asked. "I have something to handle before I follow." She looked at him. He looked back. "Go," he said. Not unkindly. She went. Min-jun was already in his shoes. She didn't ask how he'd known. She clipped his jacket and picked up the rabbit, and they moved through the service corridor at a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough not to trigger the sound sensors she'd noticed on her first tour of the floor. She kept him on her left side, between her body and the wall, the way she'd instinctively positioned herself the night of the fire. The service elevator smelled of cleaning supplies and recycled air. It descended without music and without announcement and opened onto a corridor of bare concrete and fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. Sublevel 2 was empty. She could hear the ventilation system and her own footsteps and nothing else. She heard him before she saw him, a shift of weight against concrete, the sound of someone who had been standing still for too long and had just decided to stop. She pressed back against the wall and put Min-jun behind her, one hand braced against his chest, and scanned the row of parked vehicles ahead. The man was between them and the gray car. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing the uniform of the building's maintenance staff, which was exactly what made him wrong, because maintenance staff didn't stand in the middle of an empty parking level at 11:30 at night with their hands loose at their sides and their weight forward. Rebecca made a series of rapid calculations. There were 12 parking bays between her and the car. The service exit was behind her. Min-jun was 4 years old and could run, but not far and not fast, and she was not leaving him to draw a threat away because that required trusting that the threat would follow her and not him. She squeezed Min-jun's hand once, their signal for stay close and be very quiet. He squeezed back. She went around a long way, using the row of vehicles as cover, and the man heard her footsteps and moved toward the sound, and she moved faster. She reached the gray car, got Min-jun into the back seat, and had the key in the ignition before the man cleared the last parked vehicle and stepped into the open. He had something in his hand. He raised it. She put the car in reverse and floored it. The rear bumper caught the concrete pillar behind her and the impact shuddered through the frame, and she didn't look back, just swung the wheel and drove forward, and the service tunnel opened ahead like a concrete throat, and then they were through it and up the ramp and out into the cold wet street, and she drove for 6 blocks before she exhaled. From the back seat, Min-jun touched her shoulder with one finger. She glanced in the mirror. He extended his pinky. She extended hers over the headrest, and kept driving. Ji-hoon's instructions had included a secondary location, a warehouse district on the Lower West Side, a specific address, a door code, and she'd committed it to memory on the elevator ride down because she'd learned in the past 5 days that Ji-hoon Park did not say things that were not likely to be needed. She left the car 3 blocks short of the address, in an alley between a commercial laundry and a shuttered auto shop, because the approach was too open and she didn't know what was waiting. She lifted Min-jun onto her back, he locked his legs around her waist without being asked, and moved on foot through the rain. Chicago in the early hours had a particular texture, wet asphalt reflecting the orange of distant street lamps, the smell of exhaust and river water and wet concrete, the silence that wasn't actually silence but the low compressed hum of a city that never fully slept. She moved along the wall side of the sidewalk, in the shadow line, and let the rain do what rain did, blur the edges, muffle the footsteps, make the city smaller. He was faster than the one in the parking level. Better at it. He had come from upwind and he timed his approach to the gap between street lamps, and if she hadn't been watching the shadows move along the alley wall she would not have seen him coming until he was already on her. She made them count. She set Min-jun down against the wall, one hand signal, flat palm facing him, stay and do not move, I mean it, and she turned and she did not back up. She moved toward him, which was not what he expected, and the half-second of recalibration was enough. She caught his extended arm at the wrist, used his forward momentum against him, and drove him sideways into the chain-link fence that ran the length of the alley. He was larger than her by 50 pounds and trained in ways she was not. But she had grown up in a neighborhood where reading danger early and responding faster was not a skill, it was a survival condition. And she was angry, and fear and anger together, when you didn't freeze under them, were not nothing. He got his balance back and came at her again. She used the dumpster. She used the chain link. She used the narrow angle of the alley itself, too tight for him to use his size as leverage, and she took damage doing it, a forearm across her cheekbone that sent white light through her vision and dropped her to one knee, but she came back up and she did not stop. She stopped him with the dumpster lid. Swung it once, hard, the flat metal edge connecting with the side of his knee. He went down. She didn't wait to confirm the outcome, she grabbed Min-jun from the wall, pressed him against her shoulder, and covered the remaining 60 feet to the warehouse door at a dead run. Her hands were shaking when she punched in the door code. They had never shaken before, not in the fire, not in the parking level. They shook now, which was fine. Shaking meant the adrenaline was doing its job, not that she was done. He looked at her cheekbone. He looked at Min-jun. He looked at her hands, which had stopped shaking because she had decided they would. He didn't say anything. He stepped back and let them in and closed the door behind them, and the look on his face was the same one she'd seen in the kitchen, that fractional, controlled thing that was more than composure and less than relief. There were two, she said. Sublevel 3 and the cross alley on Carpenter. I don't know if there are more. There is one more, he said. And I know exactly who sent them. The hangar was 40 minutes outside the city, off a service road that had no signage and existed on no commercial map. It belonged, technically, to a logistics company that itself belonged to a holding entity that dissolved and reconstituted itself on a rolling 18-month cycle. Ji-hoon had explained none of this to her. She had read it in the folder Kong had left on the warehouse table, and Kong, she understood now, was one of the people whose loyalty had remained uncontested, because he was the one who had handed her the folder. The traitor had a name. She didn't say it out loud. Neither did Ji-hoon. But it was in the folder, and the folder was the reason they were at the hangar, and the hangar was where it was going to end. Min-jun was with Mrs. Seo in a vehicle parked a quarter-mile back up the service road, the furthest he had been from Rebecca's physical proximity in 5 days, and the fact that he had not objected, had simply extended his pinky and held her gaze for 3 full seconds before releasing her, told her that he understood in whatever way a 4-year-old could understand that she needed to go do something without him. The hangar's interior smelled of aviation fuel and old machinery. High ceiling, poor lighting, a row of shipping containers along the eastern wall that created corridors of deep shadow. Ji-hoon's men had taken 3 of the 4 entry points. The 4th had been left intentionally open. The man who came through it 20 minutes later was the lead firefighter from the night of the townhouse fire, the one who had been first on scene, the one who had handed Rebecca a thermal blanket with a hand that she now knew had also set the secondary incendiary devices meant to ensure the building became a tomb. He had a gun and 2 men behind him and the particular confidence of someone who believed the intelligence he was operating on was accurate. It wasn't. The GPS signals from both devices in his pocket, the ones he was using to track their location, were transmitting from inside an empty shipping container 40 feet to his left. Ji-hoon had replaced the originals with duplicates before they'd left the glass tower, and the traitor had spent 6 hours moving toward a ghost. What followed was not the kind of confrontation that resolved cleanly. It compressed into a series of specific moments, the firefighter pivoting when Ji-hoon stepped out of the shadow of the containers, the 2 men behind him separating, Kong coming in from the north entry, the controlled chaos of people in a dark space making fast decisions about force and position. Rebecca was at the eastern wall with a flare gun she had taken from an emergency kit on the way in, because she was not a soldier and she was not armed, but she had walked through a burning building twice in 1 week and she understood fire in a way most people in the room did not. When the firefighter broke from the main confrontation and ran for the east exit, ran directly for the east wall, directly for the fuel line that ran along the base of it, directly toward the single route that would put him outside and free, she didn't think about it. She aimed at the concrete below the fuel line, not the line itself, because she understood accelerants and she understood angles, and she fired. The flare hit the fuel spill that had been seeping from a cracked connector for God knows how long, and the east wall became a curtain of fire that rose 8 feet and sealed the exit in under 3 seconds. He stopped. The heat drove him back. He turned and Kong was there, and it was over. Rebecca stood with the empty flare gun and watched the fire she had made burn against the east wall, controlled, contained, doing exactly what she had told it to do, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since the night she had gone through the townhouse window with a child in her arms. Ji-hoon appeared beside her. His suit jacket was gone, his collar open further than she had ever seen it, a cut above his eyebrow that he had not paused to attend to. He stood with her and they watched the wall burn itself out in the controlled way it was going to, and he said nothing for long enough that the silence became a kind of conversation. "You knew what you were doing," he said finally. "I knew what fire was doing," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her in the orange light. "Perhaps. But most people run from it." "I have a 4-year-old to go get," she said. "Can we have this conversation in the car?" And for the second time since she had known him, the corner of his mouth moved. Min-jun was asleep in Mrs. Seo's lap when they reached the car. He woke when Rebecca opened the door, not startled, just surfacing from wherever he'd been, and he looked at her face in the dim interior light, the bruise forming along her cheekbone, the soot that she hadn't entirely cleared, the fact of her being there, and he raised his pinky without a word. She touched hers to it. He went back to sleep. They were back in the city before dawn. Not the glass tower, Ji-hoon had a different location, a brownstone in Lincoln Park that was unremarkable from the outside and nothing like a fortress from within, which was, she was beginning to understand, exactly the point. The fortress had failed. The ordinary building, properly secured by people whose loyalty had been tested and held, was the safer thing. She sat with Min-jun until he was deeply asleep in a proper bed in a proper room and the dawn was beginning to gray the windows. Then she went downstairs and Ji-hoon was in the kitchen again. This had apparently become their place, the kitchen at impossible hours, and there were 2 cups of tea that were actually hot this time. He slid one toward her. She sat and wrapped both hands around it and let the heat move into her palms. He placed a document on the table. She looked at it without touching it. It was her employment contract. The one she'd signed 8 months ago through the Nanny Now agency, her name, his name, the hourly rate, the terms of engagement. He had drawn a single clean line through the entire page. "I'm voiding it," he said. She looked at him. "The contract defines your relationship to this family as a transaction. An hourly rate. A set of terms and conditions. A document that either party can end with 2 weeks' notice." He paused. "That is no longer an accurate description of what you are." "And what am I?" Her voice was very level. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the jacket he had put back on somewhere between the hangar and the car, because Ji-hoon Park apparently could not function in a state of sustained dishevelment, and placed a ring on the table between them. It was not a diamond. It was a sapphire, deep blue, set simply in a band of dark metal. No ornament. No excess. The kind of thing that communicated what it was without announcing it. She didn't pick it up. "In my family," he said, "there are 2 kinds of people. Those who are employed by us, and those who belong to us. The second category is very small. It carries obligations I will not pretend are uncomplicated." He met her eyes. "It also carries protections that no employment contract has ever been able to provide. You're not asking me to marry you. No. I am marking you as permanent." A pause. "As someone this family is obligated to, rather than someone obligated to us. The ring is a signal to people who know how to read it. It means, she is untouchable. She is ours. Anyone who moves against her answers to me." She looked at the sapphire on the table between them. She thought about her mother's dialysis schedule. Her shoebox of thank you notes. The $22.50 an hour that had seemed, 8 months ago, like a reasonable arrangement between 2 parties who understood what they were to each other. She thought about a 4-year-old boy extending his pinky finger in the back of a moving car after she had broken a man's knee in a dark alley on his behalf. If I take this, she said slowly, I'm not your employee anymore. No. And I'm not your property either. Something moved in his expression. No. That is not what this means. He said it without defensiveness, as a simple correction of a factual error. Then what does it mean? He was quiet for a moment. Ji-hoon Park, who chose every word with the precision of a man who understood that in his world, words carried consequences, was quiet for a moment in a kitchen in a Lincoln Park brownstone at dawn, and she could see him searching for the accurate thing. It means, he said finally, that I owe you a debt I cannot calculate. And that Min-jun, he stopped. Started again. My son stopped speaking to every person in that building. He spoke to you. He trusts you in a way that I have not been able to earn, and I am his father, and I am not too proud to recognize that that trust is the most valuable thing currently under my roof. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the city coming slowly awake outside. Somewhere upstairs, a small boy slept with a one-eared rabbit and a language he had invented himself. Rebecca picked up the ring. She did not put it on. She held it in her palm and looked at it, the deep blue of it, the simplicity, the weight of what it represented and the complications it would bring and the question of whether the woman who had walked into a burning building 6 days ago had become, in those 6 days, someone who could live inside the answer to those complications. She thought she might be. Ji-hoon looked at her hand. Then at her face. He gave a single nod, small, precise, the nod of a man accepting a term he had not been certain the other party would agree to. You'll want a new contract, she said. Different terms. Real ones. Yes. And my mother's medical bills. Already arranged. She looked at him. You did that before you put the ring on the table. Yes. That's very presumptuous of you. Yes, he agreed. And the corner of his mouth moved again, less briefly this time, and it changed his face into something that was not the Iron Dragon and not the composed billionaire but something underneath both of those things that she was only beginning to have the language for. She drank her tea. He drank his. The city finished waking up outside, and inside, for the first time in 6 days, the silence was not the silence of danger or shock or careful calculation. It was just quiet. And it was enough. As the smoke cleared from the hangar, Rebecca looked at Ji-hoon and Min-jun. They were covered in ash, but they were alive. She realized then, they would never burn again. And that is the story of the soot-stained shield. What did you think? Did Rebecca make the right choice staying with the Iron Dragon, or should she have taken the boy and run from the Mafia world altogether? Let me know in the comments below, I read every single one. If you enjoyed this high-stakes protector romance, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. I post every day of the week, and you won't want to miss the next twist.